Hi, and welcome to Make Your Own Rules, the Mavericks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Christian Roy, and this is the place to be to become your best self, do work you love, and live life on your terms. On this podcast, we speak to Mavericks who inspire us. We aim to get the insight and wisdom from their story to give you the clarity, courage, and conviction that you need to make your own rules. And let's face it, one of the biggest barriers to living life on your terms is the lack of time, just having too many things to do, right? If we could just get ourselves a bit more organised and productive, things would be better, or at least that's what we tell ourselves. Well, productivity expert Chris Bailey believes that it's not about managing time, it's actually about managing your attention. Social media and split focus are ruining the quality of our lives and what we accomplish. And in his new book called Hyperfocus, Chris looks at what mindfulness really means and how it can supercharge our productivity and our lives. Chris is just a really warm, compassionate man who's super knowledgeable and full of practical tips. I also really love that he's quite a productivity geek as well. In this podcast, we talk about the neuroscience of productivity, meditation as a time management tool, and the difference between getting stuff done and accomplishing meaningful goals. So with that, let's jump right in. So hi Mavericks, welcome to the Mavericks Unlimited podcast again. It's your host here, Christian Roy. And today we have a very special guest all the way from Ontario, Canada, and that's Mr. Chris Bailey. Hi Chris, how are you today?
I'm good, man. How are you doing?
Yeah, doing just great, thanks. So Chris, thank you for being on the show. Mavericks, Chris is an author in the space of productivity, of attention, of mindfulness. And he has a new book coming out in the UK this week, came out in the US last week, called Hyperfocus. So, Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got to this topic, and kind of the year of productivity project that kind of
that takes me back. That was I've always been a big nerd about a lot of different things, but productivity is probably the interest that takes the cake as being the one that I'm the biggest nerd about. So it's been in the backdrop against the life I've been living for as long as I can remember. But through high school, I would try to find ways to get mid-90s grades without doing much work. Then that continued through university and the few corporate internships I worked in that point. Just trying to squeeze as much out of the limited time I had every day, because ultimately I'm a very lazy person, and so I want more time to be lazy and think and read books and write a little bit, whatever I want. And so that interest carried through to when I graduated from university, and I received a few full-time job offers. But I thought, if there's a time when I could actually do something that interests me and that I love and that I'm really curious about, it's then. So I declined the jobs to start something called a year of productivity, which was essentially a year of my life where I dove as deep as I possibly could into this world of productivity advice, these hacks, these tips, these mind tricks, and also the deeper advice, all in an effort to separate what worked from what didn't. And luckily that gained a following. It led to a book called The Productivity Project. That led to a second book called Hyperfocus. And luckily I just get to continue doing this for a living because of that initial risk and that initial curiosity.
I love that. And that's a big thing for someone who's just left college to do. So, so here you are having just Hyperfocus is just coming out. I mean, as we were talking about just before we hit record, one of the biggest challenges for our audience, Mavericks out there, is just so many things pulling their attention, being mid-career, possibly having families. But let's face it, we live in an attention-starved world these days anyway, and with social media and all that's a whole other thing. So tell us a little bit about the book, what the kind of focus is, and then let's dive in a little bit more from there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I noticed this phenomenon in myself, and this is often tough to talk about as somebody who makes his living as a productivity expert. After the Productivity Project came out, I noticed that I was more distracted at that point than I had been in years.
Really?
I tended to social media more often. It kind of, I found that I didn't have time to read anymore. And what I quickly realized is that I had the time to read. I was just spending it on Instagram and email and looking at the news.
Right.
And I thought, okay, maybe I don't have the attention for it instead. And I found that I didn't have the attention for a lot of different things in my life, and realized a couple things at that point, that maybe if I was going through this as somebody who's so into productivity, that other people are as well. And that second of all, maybe if I'm giving advice that we should resist distraction and all that stuff, and it's not working for me when I'm not on a tight deadline, maybe there's a bigger picture that I'm missing with regard to that idea. And
Mm.
so I did a similar deep dive. I don't know if you ever watch any of those crime shows where somebody's solving a murder and they have a big map in their
Yep.
office with string attached to
Yep.
pictures, attached to memos, attached to newspaper articles. That was like my office, but with hundreds of journal articles related to how we focus. Because I found that the books out there weren't good enough, frankly. And there's enough books about time management, but not really any about attention management. So that's really what
Mm.
I set out to create. Where the gaps exist in the research, I did experiments. I talked to the experts, and I found that a lot of different curious things, like that we're distracted an awful lot, but that this distraction isn't necessarily our fault.
Mm.
I discovered things like that. The state of our attention is really what determines the state of our lives. If we're distracted in each moment, these moments accumulate day by
Mm.
day, week by week, month by month, year by year, to create a life that feels distracted and overworked and overwhelmed. If
Right.
we pay attention to what's meaningful in the moment, a conversation like this one, a book we're reading, a partner that's sitting across from us at a restaurant, and we pay attention to what's productive, the things that we really want to accomplish, our side hustle that leads us to accomplish more, creative hobby, whatever it might be, then our lives become more productive and meaningful as a result, because that's how we manage our attention. But productivity is great, but it's in the moment by moment basis that we actually progress our lives and our work forward in a meaningful and productive way. And so I think that's where the power of managing our attention deliberately and well comes into play, because there's just so much room there to do better.
Mm, mm. I love that, and there's something very rich there around. Let's face it, as you said, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of books on time management. But at the end of the day, we all have the same amount of time, right? You can't actually manage time; it marches on, but you can manage where you place your attention. So,
Yeah.
so being kind of really practical then.
Hmm.
Because so many people are, and I love what you said about like how those moments of distraction accumulate. If you're in one of those lives where you have all these distractions and things have accumulated and you feel like you don't have enough time, how do you begin to turn that boat around? What's the kind of the first step, as it
I think you need to look at how stimulated you are by default. And this is kind of, it's something that moves in waves. So we're on vacation, for example, and we're not that stimulated. We're relaxing on the beach with a pina colada
were?
and
Hmm.
a book and maybe a loved one there. And then afterwards, we return to a hyper distracted state where we wake up and it's our phone that wakes us up, and we bounce around between a loop of 5 or 6 apps before we get out of bed, and then we go to work. That the latest research that I found says that we switch between tasks every 40 seconds when we're trying to focus on something at work. So we barely work on something for a minute. So we have kind of these rhythms of our lives where on vacation, people always seek out vacations, but I think they seek out that reduction in stimulation just as much, because it's what allows us to think deeply. It's what allows us to set goals and step back from our life to plan. And so I think that stimulation is a great place to start. That there are certain attributes that an object of attention can have that naturally are magnets for our attention. There's 3 of them, in fact.
Mm.
So our attention naturally gravitates to anything that is, first, pleasurable,
Yep.
second, threatening, and third, anything that's novel. And so we even have a mechanism in our mind that rewards us with dopamine each time we focus on something new
Right.
and novel. And so we have all this dopamine coursing through our mind when we're in this overstimulated state where we don't really dive into anything too deeply. We don't really explore and think too deeply about what's on our plate, and we can't become immersed and switch between things as well as we can, say, when we're on vacation. But I think it's kind of possible to have that vacation feeling more of the time by
Right.
ratcheting down how frequently we switch between things and seek out these novel stimuli in our environment. And, it makes things less attractive in the moment at first.
Mm-hmm.
But I think as you begin to read books again, as you begin to have your attention bat around less often by social media, as you're able to focus more deeply on what's actually important, then you see all the gains that are to be made. But so much of it comes from, I think, recognizing, taming distractions. It's good advice to give, but it's hard to take. I think a good place to start is, how much meaning do these elements of your life actually provide you with? Would you say Twitter provides you with a deep level of meaning? Do you feel happier when you're on Twitter versus having a conversation with your spouse? Do you feel happier on Facebook than you do diving into a creative hobby or reading a book and having the attention for that? And I think the answer a lot of the times is we're more stimulated, but we're not necessarily experiencing more meaning or accomplishing as much through these things. So I think it comes from ratcheting down the screen time that is a big part of it too.
Yeah. Absolutely. So that being the case, I mean, as we talked about before we hit record as well, a lot of this comes down to, as you say, being in the moment, mindfulness, that kind of thing. And mindfulness is obviously one of those big words in business and in life these days. And I think a lot of people associate it with meditation or whatever else. What does it mean to you on a day-to-day basis?
Well, we rarely check up on what's in our mind. That's what it means to me. Mindfulness is noticing what our mind is full of. If it's full of distraction in the moment, essentially, it's just checking up on what we're paying attention to. That's all it means for me. This speaks to a construct in research called metacognition, where we're essentially thinking about thinking. That's all mindfulness is to me. Meditation. I'm looking at my meditation cushion right now. It's right by my desk. I sit for about 30 minutes a day, but also try to practice this awareness of where our attention is at throughout the day too. One of my favorite strategies to bring things, like you're saying, to the tactical level is having an hourly awareness chime, whether on your phone, whether on another device. And when the chime goes off, ask yourself, okay, what am I focusing on now? Am I distracted? Am I working with intention on something that's actually important, or did I just focus on what is latest and loudest in my environment? What, in other words, what's most pleasurable, threatening, and novel? And so I think that's what it means for me, is checking up on where our mind is at. But if we find that it's somewhere that we're not comfortable with, that we don't want it to be, then realigning it to pay attention to something that is a more fruitful object of attention.
And I know when we kind of start to focus on those things that are more fruitful, then obviously we begin to focus more. And I know in the book you kind of talk about a couple of different types of awareness, as it were. You talk about hyperfocus and also scatter focus. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so these were a couple surprising findings that I made from the research. Well, hyperfocus wasn't too surprising. It's essentially it's the word I use to describe the attentional state where our full attention is devoted to one thing, but we chose to focus on that thing. So it's this full attention coupled with this deliberate attention that I think is what makes hyperfocus so powerful, because we're focusing on something important and meaningful, and we're bringing our full selves to it. We're not spreading ourselves thinly across a few different things. But scatter focus is what is unfocusing deliberately. So in any moment of the day, we're either focused on something or we're unfocused and we're letting our mind wander. And this is a surprising finding from this whole project. Looking at all this research, building my murder map, essentially. What a terrible term, murder
I
map.
love pay such a visual though. I love it.
It does, yeah. Who murdered our attention? Who's responsible for for this? But this flip side of focus is, I think, not talked about enough
Hmm.
and not practiced enough, because it's when our attention is at rest that we become the most creative. So we're
Mm.
productive when we're focused on something, but we also need these moments of this hazier attention when we're taking a shower and our best ideas come to us.
Oh, yeah.
The fascinating thing about when our mind is, when we let it wander deliberately, is it has a propensity to wander toward the future. And so, we think about the future about half of the time when our mind is wandering,
Mm.
versus one study I encountered over the course of writing the book that blew me away. And it was that we think
Mm.
about our goals 14 times as much when our mind is resting and wandering versus when we're focused on something. And so
Really?
this is what, if we want to work with more intention, if we want that purposefulness behind what we're doing, we need to let our mind rest. This is when we recharge, of course. We need to recharge our attention, but we also need to choose what we focus on in the first place. And that's what gets us there while we connect the ideas that are swirling around in our minds.
Mm, mm. As you're talking, I'm reminded, kind of in a slightly different way, of Daniel Pink's thinking fast and slow, as it were, and the different thinking modes.
Daniel Kahneman. Yeah.
Sorry, Daniel. Sorry, Kahneman. Even I've been reading too many Daniels recently. Sorry.
Yeah, there's a lot of Daniels out there.
Really are, aren't there? A lot of Daniels. So in terms of, like, if I'm, say, sitting down at my desk in the morning and I've got like a pretty long to-do list and all that kind of thing, what's the best way for me to kind of ease into that day, as it were, with mindfulness, with kind of with deliberate attention, to really set myself up for having a good environment to kind of work, as it were.
Yeah, one of my favorite strategies for this is it's just setting intentions more often. And the rule that I love to follow myself is called the rule of three. And it goes something like this. So at the start of the day,
Mhm.
you fast forward to the end of the day in your mind and you ask yourself, by the time that this day is done, what three main things will I want to have accomplished?
Wow.
And it's very simple, but there's something odd about the way our attention is wired, where we're wired to think in threes. We have sayings like good things come in threes, and
Mm,
celebrities die in threes, and the third time's the charm, and the good, the
that's
bad,
true.
the ugly, blood, sweat, and tears. We grow up immersed in stories like the three little bears, the three blind mice, the three little pigs, the three musketeers. The
Absolutely
list,
right. You thought about this a lot, haven't you?
I think about things a bit too much, to be honest with you. It's a and so it's a number that fits comfortably. We can chunk around three or four unique pieces of information in our attention at once, so it fits comfortably in our attention. That's kind of the attentional limit, three or four things.
Mm.
And you see this often with phone numbers, and so we chunk those into often groups of three and four, maybe more groups of four if you're off in the UK. But you don't say my phone number is 1,613,800. You say it's it's 1,613,898 blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
And so you say it in chunks of three and four. And so this rule fits with the way that you think. So you actually
Mm.
remember the intentions that you set, but at the same time, you can only pick three. So you have to choose what's actually important over the course of the day. And I highly recommend putting them on your whiteboard. If you have a whiteboard in your office, or just a sheet of
Mm.
paper on your desk, or in a notes app, if you carry a notes app around with you. And it's a great reminder. And so when you notice that your mind is wandering, when you notice that maybe your hourly awareness chime goes off, and that you're distracted on something that's not that important, you think, okay, what should I work on now? You choose something that's important on that list because those were the intentions that you set. Then you can go back on a more productive course.
Absolutely, and there's something that you said there that I want to pick up on, which was around kind of fast forwarding to the end of the day. It's almost like traveling
Yeah.
forward in time to look backwards, as opposed to doing what a lot of us do, which is going to input mode, which is just
Mm.
kind of what are the three things I need to just focus on today, and then we get distracted. Is there a thinking behind the fast forwarding to the end of the day, beginning with the end in mind, as it were?
Wow, I'm so happy you caught that. Not many people catch that, and it's because it's so difficult to step inside the shoes of our future self.
Mm.
And so, often we're just kind of going on this autopilot mode. We're dealing with what's latest and loudest, and we rarely think about ourselves in the future. Right next to me here on the desk, whoever visits me in my office here is often creeped out by this, but I have an old man picture of myself, and so it's done with an
Wow.
app called Aging Booth, where you take a self portrait or
Yeah.
selfie, as some people say. It shows you what you look like 40 years, 50 years down the line. It adds a bunch of wrinkles and age spots, things like that. And it's a great way of connecting with your future self, because we are so often disconnected with our future selves. So we think of the fascinating thing about that is, if you lay a bunch of people down, you ask them to think about their themselves in that moment, and themselves in the future, and a total
Mm.
stranger like George Clooney or Taylor Swift or whomever,
Yeah.
um, they see their future selves as a total stranger. In other words, most of the time,
Mm,
that the
mm.
brain scans are almost identical to one another. And the more disconnected you are with your future self, it's not just some weird phenomenon. You'll save less for retirement. You'll procrastinate more, because it's as if you're giving a task to a total stranger to do. It's like you're giving an Excel sheet to Taylor Swift to finish off with. And so,
Wow.
by stepping in the shoes of your future self, I do this at the start of each day. I do this at the start of each week too. So when Sunday rolls around, I think, okay, by the time this week is done, what three main things will I want to be different in the world, in my work, in my life? What will I want to have accomplished?
Mm.
And it's thinking in those terms, not just what do I have to do, but what do I want to accomplish? You make sure you move your work forward, thinking to the end of the day or the end of the week. You're able to really minimize regrets with living a day and a week of your life, while also overcoming that impulse to just focus on what's latest and loudest.
Mm, mm. And there's also something there, isn't there, about creating a gestalt. So, I mean, that's a term in psychology where we create a whole, I guess. So when I guess when you're kind of stepping into those steps of your future self, you're focusing on the what, the outcome, rather than the how. And very often,
Yeah.
I guess the thing that trips us up or wigs us out is how am I going to get there? How am I going to do this kind of thing? Whereas I really like that you're kind of setting this thing in the future, and I love that word of what do I want to be different in the world? I think you said.
Mm.
So I love
Yeah.
that. I absolutely love that.
Well, this is like, we so often fall into these patterns of busyness, don't we? Where,
Mm,
and this is something that I found in myself before writing this book, where I had never been so busy, but while accomplishing so little.
right.
And it's a weird phenomenon, because we tend to look to how busy we are, as a measure for how productive we are, because it's so hard to measure our productivity especially when we do knowledge work for a living. It's not like we're cranking out widgets on an assembly line, and if we make 4 widgets one day instead of two, we're twice as productive. We could
Hmm.
write 400 lines of code instead of 200. Those 400 lines of code could have twice as many bugs and half as many features. And so the work isn't always as cut and dry. And so we look at, okay, how many words did I write? How many lines of code did I write? How much did I produce, instead of how much did I actually accomplish? What's different in the world because I lived a day of my life? I really,
Mm,
and this is something that changed in my own mind in researching productivity. Is I used to think about it as doing more, 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 faster, faster, faster.
right. Right.
But as time went on, I started to see it as, okay, what it's doing the right things, and doing those things deliberately and with intention behind that. And intention, I think, is the yardstick against which we should measure our productivity.
Mm, I Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And what I love is that is what do I want to accomplish? What do I want to be different in the world because I've lived a day of my life? One of the things, any coach, and I'm a coach and will tell you, is it's about the questions you ask yourself, the powerful questions. And
Hmm.
that just elevates the level of thinking and conversation beyond what have I got to do today. It's a
Yeah.
wholly different ball game. That is a fabulous question, Chris.
What's your favorite question to ask yourself each day?
um what what do I want today? You-
Hmm.
that's my thing. What do I want today? And it's because for me that's about engaging my emotional self as well.
Yeah.
So
Huh,
yeah,
love
so
that.
yeah. So let's we've talked a lot about where to focus and all that kind of stuff. I know one of the things you talk about in the book, which is a kind of a kind of controversial productivity subject, is the subject of multitasking, um,
Yeah.
and whether we can do it or not. And the old adage of men can't multitask and all that kind of thing. What's your take on multitasking from the research and from your experience?
Yeah, this is a fascinating phenomenon, and I think multitasking is very misunderstood. And it's because we can't actively focus on more than one thing at one time. And so, we can't have that concurrent attention. And so, what people really refer to when they mention multitasking is this rapid switching between things that in the moment makes us busier but less productive. And the reason why it makes us less productive is actually quite fascinating, and it's because, well, first of all, to revisit multitasking, we can't focus on more than one thing, but we can do more than one thing at one time, especially with regard to habits. Because once we spend a bit of attention to initiate doing a habit, our brain
Mm.
runs through the rest of that habit sequence in our mind, largely on autopilot mode. And we only have to uh, expend a bit more of attention to focus on that thing when we have to intervene on that habit sequence. And so, what the hell does that mean? We're driving home and we see that a detour sign has been posted. We can't take our familiar route. And so, we have to turn down the radio that we're listening to give our attention to following that route because we can't do it on autopilot mode. Our brain can't run through the habit sequences. But when we're doing work, I mentioned that stat. We switch between tasks every 40 seconds.
Yeah.
This is the task switching that we do. And the fascinating thing, the reason why this costs us productivity and meaning, this is one of those things where I went into the research thinking, okay, if this switching, because it makes it more stimulating to work that way. So if our work takes a bit longer when we do that, maybe that's fine. It's more of an engaging work. Time seems to go by a bit quicker. But the reason why it doesn't work, tasks take about 50% longer compared to when we focus on something from start through completion. So we can multitask,
Wow.
but just with habits. But there's this certain residue that exists within our attention as we switch from one thing to another. And so we're having this conversation right now. And as soon as we hang up on the call and we switch to doing something else, we won't be able to focus on what we're doing completely. Like, let's say we each pick up a book after this conversation finishes, a certain part of our attentional space will be devoted to the conversation that we were just having. It'll be remembering things we were talking about. It'll be
Sure.
saying, oh, I wish I could have said that instead of that. It'll be saying, it'll be recalling and reliving that experience. And we do this throughout the day, but on a very micro level. So we switch to from Instagram, spending on 40 seconds on that, to doing email for 40 seconds. Then we go to Excel for 40 seconds, and we have a meeting, and we focus for 40 seconds in that before we pick up our phone for another 40. And so this is our state of divided attention. And so because there's this residue that exists within our attentional space, we can never completely switch to something else.
Yeah.
So this is why it takes us longer to switch between everything, because we can never do that cleanly because we're constantly switching so often. So I think it's
Makes
this,
sense.
not to get too bogged down in the research, but this constant craziness of switching between things, it, it would be fine, honestly, if we could switch from doing one thing to the next, but we can't make our mind forget what we were just doing.
Right.
There's kind of an aftertaste of that, which consumes quite a bit of our attentional space, and compromises our focus and how deeply we're able to dive into something.
That makes so much, and it's funny because now that you've actually mentioned it, it's like actually I can see that straight away in everything I do. That residue piece is absolutely true.
Yeah,
Um,
actually, meditation makes it a lot easier to switch from one thing to the next. So, if you want to multitask better, or the task switch better, excuse me, meditate. But still, you're going to experience a lot of that residue, and it's fascinating. You actually remember less too when you're rapidly switching between things. You can compare, a show you're binge watching on Netflix when maybe your phone is nearby, and your tablet's nearby, so you kind of increase your stimulation that much more when you're doing it. So there's more dopamine coursing through your mind as you're watching the show. Think about how much you remember of the shows that you binge watch versus the movies, say, that you watch in a theater, where they have to play those videos now to force people to shut their phone off before they dive into the experience.
right.
But once you do, you're able to process it that much more deeply. Your mind actually processes the world differently when you're rapidly switching between things. You process the world not through the memory center of your mind, the hippocampus, but through the habit centers of your mind, your basal ganglia, which is why you remember so much less of a show you're binge watching, or on work you're binge doing, by switching between tasks so rapidly, because you actually don't remember it. You don't process it with that part of your mind. So, the
Right.
costs, we focus on the productivity costs. Can we or can't we multitask? But the cost runs so much deeper, and they're so much more intricate than that. I think, because we have so much less meaning. We remember less. We can only see meaning in what we remember in the first place. So, if you find that the meaning that you see around you has been decreasing, maybe your attention is a good place to start to look at.
Mm. What I love about what you're saying, Chris, and where this conversation is going is productivity, as we said earlier, can be such a it can be such a hacky subject. Kind of talking about the apps you use or the mind hacks
Yeah.
or that kind of stuff. But there's you relate this right back to the research, but also kind of to the deeper sense of meaning and purpose. And surely, ultimately speaking, this is all about how do we live a life of more meaning, purpose, joy, all of that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Well, hacks are great. Like, I love talking about apps. We could probably chat about how I use things as my to-do list manager across my iPad and my phone and my watch and my Macs, all, for a good half an hour. But, all this is something that totally surprised me when I was looking at the research and kind of piecing it together and building that map, is that productivity isn't the reason to manage your attention well. It's a byproduct of managing your attention well. The reason that you should manage your attention well is that the state of our attention determines the state of our lives. Our attention is so often, what's a good way to say that, out of sync with what we're experiencing.
Yeah.
It's not grounded to what we're doing. We're having a conversation with a loved one, and what's more meaningful than that? And our uh, our mind is full of residue from our phone that we were just on, which is compromising the meaning that we're seeing in that moment. There's meaning all around us. We just need to pay attention to it. I have this
Mm.
idea that love is really no different than sharing quality attention with someone.
Mhm.
You feel someone's presence. You feel them there with you, and that's where intimacy comes from. You can't have love without that quality attention.
Mm.
And I think this is true for every part of our life. We see more meaning around us when we when we don't work in such a reactive way. Something I was thinking about the other day is like, when was the last time I went a day without looking at a screen? The
Ooh.
iPad that I have, my Apple Watch that's on my wrist, the phone. I'm good at taming distractions out of necessity because I think it's vital for my productivity. But when was the last time I didn't look at a screen? And so my fiance Arden and I, we spent yesterday not looking at screens, and we read books and we went on walks throughout town. We went to dinner. We couldn't book a reservation, but we just stumbled into a restaurant we've never been in before in the small town that we live in here in Ontario, and it's probably the most meaningful day that I've had in a long, long time. And so, I noticed that I was experiencing more meaning as I was writing the book and things like that. But going completely without screens is so, and so many ideas come to you too, things you want to do differently. You enter into that scatter focus mode on a whole new level. It's great throughout the day to have these little gaps between things, but when you do it for a longer period of time also, you just notice so much more. It's really beautiful. Not to get like all kind of try to be inspirational or anything like that, but there's so much beauty around us. We just don't notice it anymore, and that it's such a big shame because we're always looking downwards instead of outwards.
I couldn't agree more, to be honest. And I mean, just to take it to a slightly different level. I mean, I took a bit of a retreat earlier in this year in BC, actually, funnily enough. And part of that, because it's so difficult to get that internal focus and really just connect with yourself, I actually kind of took several days in the woods away from. I couldn't get a signal or anything. And you're right,
Yeah.
just your the level of, it's almost like colors become brighter, and all to go all kind of inspirational about it, but it's entirely true. It's entirely true.
Yeah,
So
and we feel some anxiety as we adjust downward into a lower level of stimulation, and we usually label that as boredom. Boredom is that feeling that we experience when we suddenly have to adjust downward into a lower level of stimulation. But
mm,
once we get past boredom, um, that is such a great place to be. The place that exists beyond boredom and beyond stimulation. It's not that stimulation's a bad thing. It's good. If our mind wasn't stimulated, we wouldn't get out of bed in the morning.
right.
But we need a balance of all these things. And so I think feeling out the other side of it is vital as well.
Love that. So let's kind of, if I can, I would just want to turn the spotlight on you, as it were, because we've talked a lot about your work and the book. But I'm kind of curious. You've spent several years now kind of doing deep dives on productivity, attention management, all that kind of thing. How do you, and I'm sure there are so many tips and techniques you've picked up along the way and all that kind of thing. How do you apply what you've learned to kind of how you organize and uh, organize your life, organize your attention? What are kind of the things you apply?
Yeah, that's such a fascinating thing. I don't follow all of my advice all of the time. And I think any quote unquote expert that says that they are is bullshitting you.
Absolutely.
They're lying to you through and through because we're all human. We all have distractions. We all have these vulnerabilities that we either show to the world or we don't. But I like to say that of the advice I give, I follow 80 to 90% of it, 80 to 90% of the time. Productivity is great, but so is vegging out with Netflix and copious amounts of Indian food. I quite enjoy that as well. It's about that wonderful balance. I think the things that have stuck with me, meditation is something that I do for productivity reasons, and
Mm.
and I have a 30-minute daily practice that I've had for years, and I wouldn't give it up for anything in the world. I find I'm able to write 40% more when I'm meditating. I find I'm able to dive deeper into conversations. I see more meaning. I'm able to ratchet down how stimulated I am by default. That's something that's really stuck with me through writing the book. Is we're so stimulated, we need to experience a lower level because it's at that lower level that we're less reactive and we're able to think more deeply and plan things more strategically. I set 3 intentions every single morning, every single week. I have 3 intentions for the year. And I revisit these constantly, making sure that the daily ones feed into the weekly ones, which feed into the yearly ones. I don't set anything in between. I follow so much of the advice that I give. And it's honestly a tough question to answer, because so much of this is ingrained in what I do. And it has been for so long, that it's such a habit, and it's so embedded in the life that I live and the person I am, that it's hard to notice in the first place.
Right.
And so I would say those, working in a less distracted state is something that I constantly, because our mind, it's not our fault that we're distracted, because our attention gravitates naturally to what's latest and loudest, but we have to get out in front of that impulse. And so I do. I work with my phone's in another room right now. I have no devices besides the one that I'm on my computer, that are connected to the internet. Things are simpler that way and more productive that way. And so, yeah, most of but it's often hard to notice. There's probably something so obvious, and and if you came and visited me here, you would say, "Why the hell are you doing that?" And I would, I didn't even notice I was doing that.
I love it. I love it. And just on a nod to those of us who are a bit geeky and a bit nerdy, we talked slightly about apps earlier and that kind of thing. How do you utilize technology to support your productivity?
I like that question, because it has to support our productivity. It can't be a distraction from it.
Right.
I think it exists to get out of the way and support our work. So I'm a big fan of the app called Things, it's a basic task manager for every iOS device under the sun. And I love it because it shows your calendar at the top and all your tasks for the day at the bottom. And I keep my 3 intentions somewhere else. And so this captures the minutia of the day. It's kind of a way by which I review the day. And what's wonderful about it is there's a logbook function of it, where you can click the logbook and you can see all of the things you did last week, last month, yesterday. And so it's a wonderful thing. At the end of the week, you get to see, I didn't feel like I was accomplishing much this week, but I did all these things. I wrote 5 articles. I did 25 interviews. I did, whatever. And so it's a great kind of way to review things too. But I actually try to minimize my use of technology, as connected as I am with it. I try to write more in paper books without my phone there. I try to read more physical books, because there's just something great about holding a physical hardcover book in your hands and diving into it, because you can't command tab to another app and check Twitter. And so, yeah, I try to minimize my use of technology, but I use it whenever I have to.
Awesome. So just to kind of bring us to a close, as it were, Chris, 2 questions I ask every guest, and one always stumps people. The first one is,
I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Well, no, the first question just is, what is the question that you haven't been asked that you'd like to be asked, and what's your answer to that question? I guess that's my way of saying any other business, as it were.
No other business. Something I love being asked. Honestly, anything about meditation. Why I think meditation makes me more productive, because I think it's one of the most underrated things that can serve to make us more productive. It takes time, but I am a big proponent of the idea that for every minute you spend meditating, you make 10 minutes back in how much more focused and creative you become. You're able to hyper focus more deeply, but also the more control you have over your attention, the better your life becomes in almost every way. Of course, you're able to focus deeper, become more creative, but you also rate your happiness as being greater than it is when you have more control over your attention. You are more likely to say you're satisfied with your life. You've been shown to experience greater mental clarity. You develop deeper relationships. What a beautiful result for just sitting on a cushion for a few minutes
Right,
every day.
right.
And so I think it's this remarkable thing that puts off so many people. But I think whenever something puts us off and whenever something makes us uncomfortable in one way, we have to use that idea as a cue that we should run toward that thing.
Yeah.
And so if we're, putting off having a difficult conversation with somebody, run toward that, because there's a better life at the end of that conversation. Whatever puts us off, it's often a sign that it's more important than we think it is on the surface. And so I think meditation helps me run toward those things, and it also helps me, man. Talking about mind wandering, our mind has been shown to wander to the future more often, at a greater proportion when we meditate. What an awesome result. We have, just as a computer has RAM, we have RAM, this mental temporary short-term storage in our mind. We have 30% more RAM with which to process the world when we have an active meditation practice. There's concrete benefits and science behind why we should adopt one.
Wow. So that being the case, what would be your quick tip for those, as you say, many people get put off or don't know how to get into it? What would be your kind of quick tip for how to start a meditation practice?
Honestly, explore the guided ones first, because through guided meditation, you can find, teachers whose styles work for you. The big thing that I think people can take away is that there's no style of meditation that is better than the others. And I think once you internalize that idea, the research shows that they all work about the same. They work in different ways, but you can argue about the narcissism of minor differences all day long, and it's they all work. And so find a few guided ones. Start small. Be kind to yourself. Be curious. Where is my mind going to go when it meditates? Because that's a good signal in and of itself. But I would say start with a guided meditation. Don't pick up some massive tome on meditation and dive deep into the practice. Start small with a small guided one, because then you have somebody to talk to you along the way, and it becomes so much easier. Then those are kind of the training wheels. Once you feel comfortable with the practice after that, start meditating yourself.
Awesome. So final question, and that simply is, if people want to find out more about you, obviously they can get Hyperfocus in all good outlets, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all that kind of stuff. If people want to find out more about you and what you're up to in the world and all that, where do they find you?
Yeah. So my site is called A Life of Productivity. It's at alifeofproductivity.com. I just got rid of the annoying newsletter pop-up that used to be there. So you can surf in an ad-free and in a newsletter pop-up free environment. You don't, feel like you need to take a shower after visiting. And so and so that's my site. That's where I write about productivity. But yeah, the book is called Hyperfocus: How to Be More Productive in a World of Distraction. If you're in the UK, the title is Hyperfocus: How to Work Less to Achieve More. And so it's always funny how books are adapted for the UK versus the US. In fact, something fun to do is go to amazon.co.uk and go to amazon.com and search for the name of the book, and you'll see everything you need to know about how the UK and the US are different in how the books look for the different countries. It's fascinating because a lot of the bestsellers lists between the two places are the exact same, but you wouldn't know it looking at what the books look like. It's always fascinating to see.
Awesome. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Chris, thank you so much. That has been kind of 45 minutes packed to the rafters of just great stuff, and I love how knowledgeable you are, and just how practical everything you've said is, and just how, frankly, there's a lot of compassion in what you've said as well, which I love. So thank you so much for your time today and spent and giving us your wisdom, as it were.
Thanks so much for having me. It's nice to be here with you.
Brilliant. And there you go, Mavericks. That was Chris Bailey, an expert on productivity. And we'll see you next time. Thank you for listening in, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now. Hey, listen up. Don't go yet. Did you get something meaningful out of this episode? Well, the most meaningful thing that you can do right now is to go and leave a review on iTunes, because those reviews are what keep us here. And please make sure to share and to subscribe to this podcast. Finally, are you unleashing your superpowers? Well, if so, show us on Instagram with the hashtag Mavericks Unlimited, and we'll see you over there. And with that, thanks so much for listening to the Mavericks Unlimited podcast at mavericsunlimited.com. Bye for now.